builds. Welcome back everybody to another episode of Ty and Gig Builds. It's just Ty here today, and I'm gonna explain to you some beginner Raspberry Pi projects I think are very important to learn or start if you're just getting introduced to the Raspberry Pi and really don't know how to get started. So with that, let's get started. Builds. Just another day at the Builds office. So primarily on Ty and Gig Builds, we do a lot of build videos. We do a lot of projects. They involve a lot of different things, Arduinos, Raspberry Pi, and woodworking mainly. Typically, we don't produce videos like this where we list off things that are good for beginners to do or just, in general, projects that are good to do, because that's not our style. But I think this video is very important because I've looked at a lot of videos like this and I've got a lot of questions from people about what projects to start if you want to do Raspberry Pi projects. And I looked myself and I couldn't find anything that I liked out there. There wasn't really anything good. A lot of them are kind of countdowns and say this is good and just do it. They don't really explain why. So I'm gonna try my best to explain some of the top 5 projects that I think you should start if you're considering getting into Raspberry Pi, or if you do have a Raspberry Pi already and dabble a little bit, maybe you should do if you want to hone your skills. So some of these projects will be primarily beginners and there will be some intermediaries in there. I'll try to do my best to explain why you should be doing these projects and why they're so cool. So one of the main reasons I think these videos are not as helpful as I'd like them to be is because they don't really explain kind of the 3 areas that I see are, big steps to tackle if you're trying to get into Raspberry Pi projects. The first one I would say is the Linux-based operating system with the Raspberry Pi. Basically, the Raspberry Pi is a little mini computer and it has an operating system in it. It could be, Raspbian, it could be Jessie, it could be RetroPie, it doesn't matter. There's a lot of different operating systems in Raspberry Pi, but the big issue with the Raspberry Pi is it's Linux-based. And not a lot of people are very familiar with Linux unless they're very tech savvy and they used it before. Now, Linux is super good to learn. I highly recommend it. But if you're new to Linux, it can be very intimidating. And what comes with learning Linux is a lot of networking skills, a lot of computer commands to remember, and a lot of different structures and different maybe concepts you're not used to. Now the second thing you probably need to worry about if you're getting into Raspberry Pi is the actual application software. In this case, it's the programming language. You probably need to know how to program in some cases if you want to use a Raspberry Pi project. And that could be, Python mainly, I've seen with Raspberry Pi, it's kind of like the go-to language, but it could be anything. Because it is Linux-based, you could use any programming language with it that is supported by Linux. I'm sure there's some exceptions to that, but that's the main concept there. So you do have to have some programming knowledge here or there to kind of get by with some of the projects. Some not so much, and we'll get into those, but for some of them you do have to know programming language, and that's a little intimidating if you haven't gotten into that. The third and last issue is probably the biggest thing to tackle, and I still myself haven't mastered it yet, and I've been doing this for a very long time, is the GPIO pins, the circuitry, and the hardware. Basically, you can hook up lots of hardware to the Raspberry. The beautiful thing about the Raspberry Pi is that it allows you to integrate with other pieces of hardware. So touch screens, LED light strips, a lot of different motors, anything with circuits, anything. And to know how to do certain things like that, you're going to need to know how to do certain types of electronic circuits and other things like that might not be firsthand if you're not into that field. Those are kind of the big 3 things that involve the Raspberry Pi and why it's so difficult to get into it. And I think it's a high barrier of entry, but I think there are 5 projects I can mention now to maybe get your feet a little wet, dip your feet in the pool a little bit, kind of maybe do one of these, and you'll be a little less intimidated, and I think anyone can do these projects. The first project that I think anyone should ever do when they start doing Raspberry Pi projects is controlling a WS2812B LED strip. If you know why I'm laughing, it's because I do so many projects with these LED strips with the Raspberry Pi. You don't necessarily need a Raspberry Pi just to do these types of strips. You can use an Arduino or an ESP8266. A lot of different microcontrollers that aren't Raspberry Pi based are great for controlling WS2812B strips. But if you're trying to just get used to the Raspberry Pi and get used to some of the commands and maybe program a little bit, it's a great start. It requires little knowledge of the OS, a basic knowledge of installing packages. It's a great intro to that. Programming wise, very simplistic. You can get a lot of demo code out there. You can base your code off of that if you want to write new code to see how to do certain things on the strip. It's great for starting programming. GPIO wise and electronic wise, it's a very simple circuit. There's really not much to it. There's a lot of documentation out there how to do this in Raspberry Pi. So if you get lost, there's a lot of references you can Google. And it's a great starting project. I really highly recommend it. The second project I'd recommend doing is very utilitarian project, very functional, very useful, is the Pi-hole. Pi-hole basically blocks every ad that's coming to you from mobile devices, streaming, from your Wi-Fi, your laptops, things like that. You're basically using the Pi-hole to block ads that are coming into your router, so every mobile device gets ad blocked. It's very beginner friendly in terms of OS, and it's a very good step to learn a little bit more about networking and how the Pi networks with other computer devices and things like that. There's little to no programming, and there's also no GPIO pin. So it's a great beginner project, very useful for the house. So the third project I'd probably start if you're doing Raspberry Pi or considering doing it is installing RetroPie and using it to emulate classic video games. If you don't know what RetroPie is, it's basically an OS that allows you to play different video games. Back the N64, Game Boy, different arcade games, just PSP and PlayStation games. And it's very fun, and NES, Sony, old Sega games. It's actually very useful. It's like a video game console that does everything. In that case, you probably want the Raspberry Pi 4 to have that extra performance boost. There's a little bit of knowledge to know about the OS, installing OS. Aside from that, it's very basic beginner knowledge. Programming, there's none, and hardware is just kind of what comes in the kit. I'll link everything in the description. People go crazy with these things. I mean, they make mini arcades out of them. I don't recommend going that route if you're a beginner. Go ahead if you feel like it, but I recommend probably starting with just the controllers and then work your way up to like an arcade cabinet or something like that. The fourth project's a little bit more abstract and kind of up to you, but I recommend probably for number 4, if you're doing a Raspberry Pi or just starting out, one of the first few, is setting up a web server. And this is a little bit abstract because you could start out with Ruby on Rails, Python, Java, PHP. There's a lot of different programming languages. I love Ruby on Rails, but that's just me. If you Google setting up a local web server on Raspberry Pi with X programming language, I'm sure there's a lot of resources. I know there's a lot of resources. It's a great start to get really familiar with the OS, and it's a great start to understand how to start to program and kind of web services and all those different types of things. I highly recommend it. There's a lot of documentation out there, so you shouldn't get lost. The hardware aspect of it, there shouldn't be any. You can integrate it any way you'd like. We've done a lot of different integrations with web servers on this channel, so check those out if you want some inspiration. But this is something that I highly recommend doing with the Raspberry Pi if you're just getting into it and you want to kind of start a project to start out with. So for the last one, it's a little bit of a loaded project here because it's not necessarily a beginner project. I mean, it is pretty simple, but it's a little bit more with setup involved in terms of building things, in terms of building a case or something like that. But I definitely recommend trying out building a magic mirror. It's basically a smart mirror that acts as a mirror. It also tells you the weather, date and time, things like that, notifications. All you really have to do is kind of set up the OS and then configure it to the preferences you'd like. And so it's a really basic one in terms of OS understanding Linux. It's a basic one in terms of programming. You don't really have to know how to program much. And there's a little bit of hardware involved, not much. So it's a great beginner project. There's a little bit of a barrier to entry in terms of building the structure to have it and kind of making the mirror itself. But aside from that, the actual Raspberry Pi stuff is very beginner friendly, and I highly recommend doing it. So those are my top 5 beginner Raspberry Pi projects. I know there's a lot more out there, but I thought these, for me, in my opinion, are the most important. They give you a good base on all those 3 categories we talked about. Of course, if you don't like those or you have some other ideas, you can look back at our videos and make a ton of Raspberry Pi projects. We also do Arduino projects and woodworking. If you're interested, I suggest you take a look. And with that, we'll end it with saying follow us on Instagram for live updates throughout the week. We'll see you next time. Builds.